Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Dr. Scott Thomas, and we're going to talk about impacting West Kentucky with the gospel, and we're also going to talk about church evangelism. Scott, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Dr. Gray, thank you for having me.
Let me tell you about Scott. Scott serves as senior pastor at Lone Oak First Baptist Church. Dr. Thomas is a third-generation pastor, graduate of the University of Mississippi, and three-time graduate from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary with a Master of Divinity at THM and a PhD. He specializes in church leadership, evangelism, prayer, preaching, and practical theology. In 2022, Scott was recognized as Researcher of the Year by the Southern Baptist Research Network. And Scott and his wife, Carly, have three young children, Scott III, Everett, and Jane Kennedy, and reside in Paducah. Scott was saved at around the age of 18 and called into ministry at age 23. And I've mentioned already, Scott, that you are a third-generation pastor. So tell us how the experience of growing up in a pastor's home, granddad is a pastor, how that has either helped you in ministry or was a challenge to you when you were processing a call.
Yeah, so my grandfather and my dad are pastors. My grandfather's no longer with us, but having a grandfather and a father as a pastor gives you a unique opportunity to see the insides and out of ministry, so that when you are processing the call or sensing a call, you're not really walking in blindly. You've already had the opportunity to see behind the curtain, if you will, to see the privileges of serving the local church and also the challenges of serving the local church. Not to mention all those incredible pastor one-liners that preachers have. I had ample opportunity to record those earlier rather than later.
Yeah. So you have, I always say just even a second-generation pastor has a leg up on everyone else because you do have, you know things instinctively that others are having to learn firsthand.
Yeah, I guess you could say you get it in your blood. There's still an intense process of learning to listen to the Holy Spirit and discern processes and people. But because you grow up around it, just like so many grew up in whatever field or industry that their parents were in, and then they took it over, you begin to understand earlier in your tenure or earlier in your ministry some of the practical decisions and some of the interfacing that's necessary just to maintain a positive and effective pastorate.
So, Scott, before we start talking about church evangelism and West Kentucky, hope for West Kentucky, you've had a couple of pretty big trips lately. You just got back from Cuba on a mission trip there. Yeah. Can you just take a minute and tell us about that?
Yeah, Cuba was a mission trip that we took I guess it's been a week and a half ago now. We were down there with a medical team, and so we sought to provide medical care and spiritual care for a church that was celebrating its 1 year anniversary or 1 year birthday. This church that had been planted in Placenta, Cuba, and we went down to provide medical care. Cuban people are severely oppressed under the tyranny of the government there, and as such, they really have an incredible need for medical supplies, but they also have a great need for the gospel. Some of their greatest gospel preachers and sound doctrine teaching is only available online because many of the more equipped and effective ministers, just for the sake of their family, are finding opportunities to escape from Cuba and find a better life somewhere else. And that's a challenge for us because we think in our American context, hey, whatever we need to sacrifice for the gospel, we're willing to sacrifice. But that first time you see your child crying as they're going to sleep hungry again, it'll cause you to rethink exactly what you mean when sacrifice. Or I heard one pastor, his daughter had 102-degree fever, a little girl, about 1, and they went to the hospital. The hospital didn't even have access to a basic medicine like Tylenol to reduce the fever, and they just had to hold their child and rock her all night, praying that God would miraculously preserve her. And you hear stories like that, and you think, okay, I understand. There's a difference between saying I'm willing to sacrifice anything for the gospel and being willing to sacrifice your family for the gospel. So we went there, had an incredible experience. We got to share the gospel. I had the privilege of personally witnessing to more than 200 people. Wow. We had 116 professions of faith. All but 12, all but 2 came from personal evangelistic conversations which is, that's where you really have to get down into the field to work the harvest when you're having personal conversations. But we praise the Lord. When you go on mission trips, it doesn't always turn out like that. So when you have the opportunity to see such a harvest in a matter of 72 hours, you just rejoice and thank the Lord.
And Lone Oak's been part of that trip for a good while, and your association is part of it. And so good to see you continuing leadership there from your part. But you also just got back from a trip to our International Mission Board, where you and several other Kentucky Baptist pastors and church leaders toured the IMB in Richmond. But you also got to sit through a commissioning service for 69 new missionaries. But one of the unique things about it was held at First Baptist Charlottesville, which is the home of a home church for missionary Lottie Moon. So tell us a couple of highlights from that trip. How was that for you?
Yeah, what an incredible trip, Dr. Gray. It was a bucket list of mine. I'm a third-generation pastor. My grandfather nor my father had ever been to the International Mission Board's facilities. And so to see what we have been giving to and leading our churches to support for three generations, it really was a privilege. You walk onto those sacred grounds where men and women, some of whom we won't see until the throne of Jesus Christ is opened up and the martyrs ascend, were trained there and taught how to do the gospel work. And to see that place was something else that I really counted as a privilege. And so I'm so thankful for Dr. Cabell there at the convention organizing that trip. Many of the trustees that we met with there were just blown away by Dr. Cabell's creativity to put together such a trip. And I think I expect that many state conventions will follow his lead on taking pastors. It will inspire their hearts, and it will motivate them to be advocates for the cooperative program and the ongoing gospel work. Some of the impressive parts, there's many things that we know about the mission field and the mission force and the training. Something that stuck out to me was when we visited the Child Learning Center. They have a school there for the children. And I knew that we took care of our missionaries, and I suspected that we took care of our missionaries' children, but I did not realize the extent to which we went to provide ample care for those children, to prepare them for the mission field. Everything from giving them exposure to different cultures, to teaching them how to go through airports, to helping them identify, resources for help in the event that they ever needed those. And then we even have a special programming to help those children re-enter American society, whether they're coming back for a stateside visit or even returning to go to college. To have a specific program that says we're not just going to send you and forget you, but we're going to watch out for you and care for you all the way until you get back home, if the Lord allows it, and find your place back in American culture. It reminds me that what we're doing is not just happenstance, and it's not just casual, but it is strategic and it is intentional. It really is the best missionary program and missionary training facility probably anywhere in the world.
And Scott, just as you said, Lone Oak's been supporting that work as well as other Kentucky Baptist churches, SBC churches, through the cooperative program now for nearly 100 years, and then also through Lottie Moon Christmas offerings. So thank you for taking that trip and then for highlighting it. I'm sure your life was impacted by it, and so glad you got to experience it. So let's talk about church evangelism. I think one of the hardest things for pastors today is trying to figure out how do they crack the code of church evangelism. What can they do to reach people who are maybe not attending their church? Maybe they can find ways to get them to attend where they can hear the gospel. What are a couple of things that you've learned or a couple of practices that you all at First Baptist Lone Oak are using to try and reach people with the gospel?
Yeah. So evangelism, if there's a way to break the code, I'm glad to hear it. Yep. It would make my ministry a lot easier. Just as a personal practice, keeping evangelism on the forefront of the church's mind has to be a primary issue for pastors. If there's something that's going to take the back seat in the local church, mission and evangelism is that thing. Because it's challenging, it's provocative, it's provoking, it's convicting. And so we just have to keep it on the forefront of our minds, telling stories about evangelism. And I would say, most importantly, is practicing evangelism. I mean, there are ample studies with anecdotal evidence that demonstrates that a church with a pastor that practices personal evangelism will be an evangelistic church. In many ways, the pastor is kind of a glass ceiling for the practice of evangelism in the church. And few times are there men and women in churches that will outpace their pastor in sharing the gospel. So if the pastor will practice evangelism, he will naturally lead the church to be evangelistic. And so I would say it's been a personal practice of mine, or it's been a personal learning of mine, just to know that my practice of personal evangelism will directly impact the church. Even if I don't talk about it, people will hear about, hey, Brother Scott was sharing the gospel with this guy. I overheard him at lunch, or I saw him knocking on doors. And those stories circulate. And sometimes those are the most effective ways to communicate the need for, the practice of, and the benefit of evangelism is simply by demonstrating it and setting the example. In addition to that, Dr. Gray, something that we've tried to do here is just to take the pressure off of people with evangelism. There's many obstacles to evangelism, and one of the great obstacles of evangelism is fear. We're fearful of encountering people that we don't know. We're afraid that they may ask us a question that we cannot answer, and then we look foolish. And then we're afraid that they're going to say no. What if we finally step across the bridge and share the gospel with someone passionately, and then they reject us? And so what we've tried to do is to remind them what the scripture says. Jesus says, go therefore make disciples of all nations. And then he tells us in Acts chapter 1, he says, when the Spirit comes upon you, you will be empowered to be my witness in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Our responsibility is never to save somebody. Our responsibility is to simply give a witness to Jesus Christ. And I tell people, hey, if you will just share, Jesus will do the saving. So just be faithful in sharing and leave the results up to God. I think that was Bill Bright's definition of evangelism. Share the gospel of Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit and leave the results up to God. That takes the pressure off of us, not the responsibility, but it takes the pressure off of us to do something that only God can do. And so in our church, I hope to lead by example by being a personal evangelist. I hope to remind my people that though we have the responsibility for sharing the gospel, we don't have the responsibility of saving people. And then finally, I think this is a critical element, Dr. Gray, that is lacking in many ways in contemporary evangelism, and that is asking people to do something with the good news, inviting a response. Here at Lone Oak, we still give an invitation at the close of all of our worship services, and we invite people to do something with the gospel. Jesus would tell people, hey, pick up your mat and go, sin no more. And it was an invitation to do something with the good news that he had given them through his presence or through his power and even through his conversation. And so we want to invite people to do something with the gospel. And so we encourage our people here, hey, tell them about the condition, the consequences of sin. Tell them the full gospel, Jesus born of a virgin, sinless life, death on the cross, buried, dead, and then resurrected 3 days later. And then invite them, would you like to choose Jesus Christ? Because ultimately one day we're going to be judged based on whether or not we chose and embraced Christ or we rejected Jesus Christ. And at the very least, we're giving people an opportunity to practice what they're going to have to say on Judgment Day.
So, Scott, outstanding. I've heard you say in there, keep evangelism in the forefront. It's two things that I picked up from what you just said, that church members, evangelism is so easy to fall off the radar because it's just not pressing. You have committee meetings that are pressing. You have upcoming events that are pressing on your time and calendar. But evangelism, no one's really begging you to go out and do that. But the other side of it is that when you're doing it and when the church picks up that you're trying to win people to the Lord, man, it means the world to church members that their pastor is leading out in this way. So thank you for doing that. The kind of trip that you just took to Cuba, and you were sharing the gospel a lot, probably most of the day. How does a trip like that impact your evangelism when you come back home?
Tremendously. The only way to get good at evangelism is to practice it. I mean, you can study all day long, but until you get out into the real world and put your feet on the street and start sharing the gospel, until you get there with consecutive practice, you really won't become a competent evangelist. And so the more you share your faith, it really gives you a unique opportunity to work through your theology in some ways. I mean, we all know the good news about we're dead in sin, Jesus died for us. But when you begin sharing it thoroughly and working through it audibly and verbally, you really have the opportunity to match your words with your heart, and to follow the Holy Spirit's promptings. And so, like Dr. Nix down in New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary says, he says, evangelism works if you'll work it, and it will change us if we will practice it. And so, the more you share, and that was a great takeaway from Cuba, just having the reps, again, just putting the reps in of one after one, 100 times a day, just sharing the gospel, start to finish, because every person is a new case. It's a new conversation. Start to finish really gives you an opportunity to refine your skill, and develop your practice of being an evangelist.
So you just said something there that I think that could easily be missed if we don't draw attention to it. We tend to put evangelism in a different category from everything else. But you said that you will not get better at evangelism without practicing it. And so if you said that about football, we'd say, oh, 100%, yeah. Or a guitar or piano or public speaking. You're not going to get better until you practice it. So why do you think it is, Scott, that we put evangelism in a different category and say, oh, no, this is spiritual. Practicing isn't, it's just a different category. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I have many thoughts. Let me share some.
Okay.
One of the reasons that we easily write off evangelism is because that's a practice that we've been handed down from generation to generation. Complacency with evangelistic practice and contentment with not sharing the gospel, or really you could call that casual Christianity. It's really something that we've learned from generation to generation. And there have always been stalwarts in the Christian faith. There's always been men and women that have set the stage for what evangelism is. And we hear the stories that Kentucky Today highlights very regularly, and I'm thankful for this. Churches that have understood that evangelism is a part of a lifestyle. It's not something that we should or can compartmentalize. But if we're following Jesus, we're going where Jesus went, and we're doing the things that Jesus did. And there were times where Jesus rested. There were times when Jesus rejoiced. And there were always times where Jesus was sharing the good news of his coming to save people. And so I think that in some ways we've just accepted that this is the way that we should be. And we've looked at evangelism as being a responsibility of some in the church, but not all in the church. But everyone has a responsibility and a call to make disciples. And quite honestly, you cannot be a disciple if you're not a disciple maker. Yeah. And that's part of the process. And so I don't know, I try to communicate it, though I may not have in this particular segment. I try to communicate it as an opportunity and a privilege we have to represent Jesus Christ among the lost and a dying world, but to also take the pressure off of people and say, hey, listen, let's just assume that you weren't taught these things. So here's a fresh start. Here's a clean canvas. Let's make it a part of your life. And again, there's no pressure. You don't have to save anyone. You just have to give a testimony about who Jesus is.
Yeah. And I mean, Jesus uses the analogy of farming. You're sowing a gospel seed. And, when a farmer plants a tobacco plant or a tomato plant or puts seed in the ground, he doesn't feel pressure to make that grow. He does feel pressure to get it put in the ground the right way, but the growth comes from somewhere else. So thank you for making that analogy. So Scott, you hadn't been at Lone Oak very long, and you led the church into kind of for lack of a better term, maybe a campaign, an evangelistic campaign that you all called Reach. And it looked like it was really kind of a boost in the life of the church. Tell us about what you did, why you did it, and what you saw happen.
Yeah, soon after we got here, and I followed Dr. Dan Summerlin. Many people are familiar with him. He is a living legend in Kentucky.
Very good.
And knowing him personally, I understand why he is a living legend. He's just an incredible guy with a wonderful heart, tremendous leadership skills, and just such a capable, experienced pastor. So when you follow someone like that, you do so with the understanding that the best I can do is not messing this up. Yeah. Like, that's what I have to contribute here, is just don't mess it up. But when we came here and the Lord called us here in such a miraculous way, we knew that one of our first main initiatives would be what we were remembered by. And so we had talked through, myself and my staff, we talked through a couple of different opportunities that we had to either address something cultural or to take on a different type of project. And just after prayer and consideration, I thought, if I can be remembered for anything, and if this is the one thing I'm starting on, it's got to be evangelism. It's got to be reaching the lost and then raising up the saved. And so we wanted to create an emphasis like that. And so we had this large installation made with the letters REACH, REACH, and then we challenged the church over a month's period of time to have 500 gospel conversations. And so the gospel conversation was specific: share with them the condition and consequence of sin, give them the gospel of Jesus Christ from his birth all the way through his resurrection, and then invite them to do something with the gospel. And so we asked the church to share 500 people, to reach 500 people with the gospel. And in order for them to qualify it as a gospel conversation, they had to touch each of those three parts. And then they could come on Sunday before the service, after the service, during the invitation, and they could turn on a light bulb to indicate that they had shared the gospel. And so the first week, it was 100 or so bulbs came on, just people. I was overwhelmed by the response of the church and the proactivity of our body to share the gospel. We get through the end, and it was evident that we were going to hit our goal. Praise the Lord. And then just before we get to the last Sunday, where we were going to announce how many bulbs had been lit and tell some of the stories of the gospel conversations, one of my production team members came to me and they're like, "Scott, we got to tell you something. There are not 500 bulbs on that board. There are 555 bulbs on the board." And I said, "Well, I'm not exactly sure how to communicate that to the church, because for a month I've been telling them we got 500 lights." But they hit it. And so we were able to celebrate. We just told them the truth. Hey, listen, the only way that these lights could look as pretty as they look and as lined up is if we had more. But you guys hit the goal. And I know that we're short on our time, but there are so many stories that I could tell about God's impact on the church and this community through that initiative. And quite honestly, today we are having people in our church doing what we call re-reach. Mm-hmm. They're going back to some of those seeds they planted, and they're either watering those seeds or they're harvesting those seeds. And we're seeing people get saved today that first heard the gospel several months ago when we were walking through the Reach campaign.
Well, thank you for leading evangelistically. I think it's one of the most challenging things to do as a pastor, and there are plenty of challenges, but I think that's difficult. And so I'm grateful for your efforts and for the Lone Oaks response. No surprise that they responded to the leadership of their pastor, and thank you for honoring the ministry of Brother Dan Summerlin. So, Scott, you're also leading out, not just in your church evangelistically, but you're also leading out in your general wider area. We've mentioned something called Hope for West Kentucky. It's in connection with the KBC annual meeting that will be held in Paducah in November. We do this practice annually. It's called Crossover, but then it has a local name, which is Hope for West Kentucky. So tell us a little bit about Hope for West Kentucky, a crusade that's coming up, and then you actually have a personal connection to the evangelist who's part of this get-together, this event.
Yeah. Hope for West Kentucky. Again, it's a part of the annual initiative of the Kentucky Baptist Convention called Crossover. Rob Patterson, the evangelism department, and the evangelism team there, they initiate the emphasis and then they hand it off to the local pastors and the local associations, because that's where the work needs to happen, because these are the same pastors that will not only reach the lost, but they'll be responsible for discipling them. And so I love the way that process works. Earlier this calendar year, I received a call from Howard Atkinson at the local association, at the West Union Baptist Association, and he asked me if I would be interested in serving as the chairman for this regional directional team to sort of head up, working with Rob Patterson at the Kentucky Baptist Convention, leading out on organizing this initiative and then driving it through to to its actual happening in November, and then helping guide the process of following up and assimilation of those that are reached by the gospel. And so he started sharing this with me, and he told me, hey, we have Ken Freeman, an evangelist out of Texas, who's coming, and we have Jason Loving's band. We have them signed up to lead worship on November 10th, just before Ken Freeman. And God just started bringing all of the pieces together, Dr. Gray. Back in 2004, my dad was a pastor in Knoxville, Tennessee. I am a freshman in college. Though I grew up in a pastor's home, I wasn't living for the Lord. And so my parents had Ken Freeman come in for a crusade like this with a partnering church in Knoxville, Tennessee. And my parents prayed for me to be one of those that would come and hear Ken preached. We are challenging people beginning this past Sunday in a 40 days of prayer for this evangelistic event, and to name 7 people that they would like to see attend the event and come to faith. And a very similar practice. My parents, my mom and dad, prayed for me to be one of those people that would come in here. On October 12th, 2004, in Knoxville, Tennessee, at Salem Baptist Church, I went, I heard Ken Freeman preach, and I responded to the gospel. And I was saved that night. And so when Howard Atkinson was telling me this, I was thinking, I'm in. Like, I don't even need to think about it. You know, I can pray about it, but I know God's answer is already yes. I want to be a part of this. Plus, the evangelistic emphasis and initiatives, it's just right up my heart alley. I love being a part of these works. It's immediate kingdom impact. And so we're off and running for several months. Really all of this year, we've been meeting with different teams, our regional directional team, working with Rob Patterson and other staff from the Kentucky Baptist Convention, organizing. And as we have been working, the initiative and the event has developed and grown. I mean, to really, in my understanding, it's really a staggering degree. Today, we have over 60 individual congregations that have agreed to pray, to promote, and to participate in Crossover Hope for West Kentucky, which is just a remarkable number. We have hundreds of volunteers that have already put their name on a list that said, I will serve in a variety of capacities to help this event happen effectively and successfully. We have Ken Freeman scheduled to speak in somewhere between 9 and 12 school assemblies. And he'll go into the public schools the week of the events, and he'll share his testimony about growing up in a rough home. And he'll give a very public school appropriate speech about making choices and choosing your friends. And then he'll give them a hook, something to the effect of, hey, if you'll come to the McCracken County Expo Center tonight at 6:30, you can hear the rest of my story and how it turned out. And so it's a real appeal to get students in. And I've worked with Ken Freeman. I've had him at churches before, and we've seen thousands of people come as a result of those public school assemblies, and hundreds get saved. And so just to kind of give you a larger picture of the events that week, if that's okay.
Oh,
because
yeah, please.
You know, with a project to this scale, there's so many components. On November the 1st, Ken Freeman will come into town. He's our evangelist. He'll begin having school assemblies on that Friday. Over the weekend, we'll continue having prayer points and times of praying for the crusade and the work. On Sunday, he'll preach in some local churches. Monday, we'll have school assemblies. Tuesday's election day, so we're all going to be on our knees praying for God's provision over our country. On Wednesday, he'll be at school assemblies, and then on Wednesday evening, we have a student event that we've organized that's specific to students, and so we're sharing that with local congregations to bring their students. We're praying to have more than 1,200 students come to hear the gospel that night, and it can be a very exciting harvest time. Thursday and Friday, we have more school assemblies, as well as we're going to have college campus evangelistic events. We've got a team from the Kentucky Baptist Convention that's working with another partner to bring people in to do spiritual surveys on college campuses in a hope that they can engage people with the gospel. On Saturday, November the 9th, we have a Spanish-speaking festival at 12 Oaks Baptist Church in Paducah, and that's a great opportunity for people that are Spanish-speaking people to come and to hear the gospel, to build community in Christian fellowship. And then on Sunday, that's the main event. On Sunday, November the 10th at 6:30 at the McCracken County Expo Center in downtown Paducah. We'll have Jason Loving's band. We're going to have 200 to 300 person choir, and we're going to have Ken Freeman preaching. Right now, we've got 4,000 seats, Dr. Gray. Mm-hmm. And I'm praying that with the number of invitations that we extend and the amount of work that the people are putting in and the prayers that are being offered, I'm praying that we have trouble fitting people in that room, even with 4,000 seats. Just the other day, we were in a deacons meeting. Actually, I was in the meeting before the meeting. I don't know if y'all ever had those when you were in your church. So often you just get to have a meeting, but the real work happens often before you go into the meeting. And so I was talking with some of my deacons before the meeting, and we were talking about the event. And I said, I believe that the Lord could bring 400 people to faith in that event at Crossover. And my outgoing chairman of deacons said, "Did you mean to say 500?" He said, "Because I believe it should be 500." And I said, "Let's go with that. Let's go with that. 500 people." Dr. Gray, I don't know that I've been in a place where I've seen 500 people at one time come to faith in Jesus Christ, but I'm hoping and praying that on November 11th, I can say I have been.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much. If folks want to know more about Hope for West Kentucky, kybaptist.org/hope, and they'll find out more. We still need volunteers, folks who will commit to pray, and we want folks to attend. Just come and bring people with you. But brother, we really appreciate you lending your leadership. It's been you all have really poured yourself into it. Your staff at church and churches, you mentioned 60 churches that are partnering together, and that's who we are. I mean, that's what separates Southern Baptist, Kentucky Baptist from other really good Baptist groups, is that we really believe that we're better together and we can accomplish more in cooperation. Scott, thank you for your ministry. Thank you for, we're glad you're in Paducah, glad you're in Kentucky, and thank you for taking the time to join Leadership Lessons.
It's been an incredible experience being in Kentucky. We love it, and I'm telling you, Dr. Gray, your leadership at the Kentucky Baptist Convention is it's personal and it really is meaningful. I remember the day. I know you've got places to be, but let me take the second. I remember the day they called me to be the pastor, and one of the first calls that I received after accepting the call to be the next pastor at Lone Oak First Baptist Church was from you. I didn't even know you had my cell phone number, and just the fact that the head of the state convention was offering a personal phone call just to say welcome, and we've been praying for you. It goes a long way. It really does. And so, Dr. Gray, thank you for being authentic and real and personal. It's a blessing for us.
Thank you, brother. Thanks for listening to Leadership Lessons. An audio podcast of this program is available on both Apple and Android devices. The Kentucky Baptist Convention was created by churches, for churches, to help churches reach Kentucky and the world for Christ. For more information about the KBC and the cooperative program which fuels our ministry, go to kybaptist.org. We'll see you next time on Leadership Lessons.